and he said, "Hey, we're putting together a prize fight for $500. Do you want to come fight someone?" And it was like 1 a.m. or midnight or something, and leave and go to this parking lot to fight someone for $500.
Welcome, everyone, to This Was The Scene, the podcast that takes a look back at the late 90s, early 2000 punk scene. I am your host, Mike Doyle. Before we start, make sure you go to my Patreon and sign up. It's patreon.com/thiswasthescene. It's for $1 a month, or you can donate one time over at thiswasthescene.com. Just scroll down. There's a purple button. And if you felt like you've wanted to do this for almost the past 5 years and haven't, now is the chance that you can do that. Since their inception in '95, Bridge 9 Records has turned from a hobby to one of the most well-known heavy music brands in the world. Headquartered in Beverly, Massachusetts with affiliates and distributors worldwide, they've put out defining releases for American Nightmare, Terror, and Champion. Today, Bridge 9 is a recognized brand worldwide as one of the best in underground music, with a roster boasting over a dozen full-time active bands. With over 300 releases to date, their back catalog includes some of the biggest and best names in underground music, such as H2O, Defeater, Ceremony, Agnostic Front, Have Heart, and many more. And it continues to get stronger. Just a disclaimer before we start, there's a lot of pops in Chris's audio track in the very beginning, but we quickly fixed that. So as you're listening, you're going to be like, oh shit, but we addressed it like super fast, so it goes away. There's some minor ones throughout, but it's not crazy. I got Chris on the Skype, and this is what we chat about. His new record store, sharing a space with Big Wheel, Hydra Head, and Doghouse, designing his merchandise, well-hitting cash, what went wrong in the early years, being part of the Yankees Sucks crew that was on 30 for 30. If you haven't heard that 30 for 30, go listen to it. It's fucking great. His relationship with Victory, Johnny Cupcakes, Polar Bear Club, Newfound Glory, would he break out of the labels genre when signing new bands, the $500 fist fight, and a ton more. Check out his new record store that's in Beverly, Massachusetts at 282 Rantoul Street. Just Google it. You can see it. It's close to 5 other record stores, a bunch of breweries, and it seems like it's a really cool spot. It's also by the Salem area where they do like the witch tours and shit. So you should go have a day there, as he says in the very end of this podcast. Lastly, if your company needs like a sizzle reel for last year's projects, then just hit me up at mike@drive80.com. I do a bunch of motion graphics and animation, so I can slap some stuff together for you in case you were thinking that, and I can do that for you as long as you pay me. That's all I got to say, so feel free to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with anyone who would love some punk rock nostalgia. With that said, let's get started. Yeah, I just saw that you opened up a record store in September of this year, right?
That's right.
And is it all Bridge 9 stuff, or do you have other bands?
We have other bands. It's Bridge 9 in name, and our catalog is here, but we carry and are trying to carry anything that's a degree or two of separation away. So it is a mainly hardcore and punk kind of inspired record store, but we're mixing it up a little bit here and there.
Is this the first time you've ever had a record store?
Yeah. We've never had like a front kind of facing retail store for Bridge 9. I have a second brand called Sully's that uses the space. Basically, when you walk into the store, the left side of the store is a record store, and the right side is a kind of a Boston-centric clothing brand called Sully's that I started back in 2000. So both brands are well into their third decade, but most people never really knew that they coexisted for all these years behind the scenes. That brand has had pop-up stores in malls around the holidays, but we've never had like our own permanent brick and mortar space until now, and together they share the space.
Dude, that's crazy. There's a record store. I talk about it all the time. There's a record store down here, and they serve beer on tap. I mean, because I don't know if you're a drinker or not.
I'm not. I've still got the edge.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. I was like, you've got it, and you got it. But usually, sometimes people from the late '90s hardcore scene, they still have the holding on to the edge. But
Yeah.
there's a record store I just frequent here, and I've never bought vinyl until I started collecting like maybe 3 years ago, and I've spent so much fucking money on records that I can just imagine this new boom that I don't see it going away. That's got to be. Was that something that gave you kind of a green light in your head to say, I think now's the time to do this?
Part of it, and I have to be honest. So we We just have a retail space, would love to have some other component built in. If we could have, like, originally when we were talking about building out the space, we thought, oh, what if we could have like a coffee counter, something that would give people an opportunity to come in, get a latte or something, and then also maybe pick up a record or two. That wasn't in the cards kind of in our current iteration of this space. But friends of ours have a store called Cortex in Berlin, and they're like the record store in Europe, as far as I'm concerned. And so they sell beer there. They can walk out on the street, sit, in front of their store and drink beer. Yeah, you can't do that here in most places. But he's like, you need to do something like that, because people will come in every day to grab something to drink, and socialize, and then also while they're there, pick up a record.
I mean, that's how I've spent so much money. Like
Yeah.
I'll sit down and have an 8% IPA, and then I'll do a lap, and then I'll go back, drink some more, I'll do a lap, and all of a sudden I'm come back with 4 records. I'm like, fuck, man.
Yeah.
That's like $150 like hour that I just had. But yeah, I mean, granted, it'd be kind of weird though, because I mean, I feel like, I don't know, was that something you would do, considering it's kind of, I mean, if you're not drinking or whatever.
Yeah. I wouldn't do like an alcohol kind of bar concept, but I would totally be into like a coffee concept. I mean, I'm definitely like have a iced mocha latte every day kind of person. And if I could tap into that and have other people that did that and give them a reason to check out what we're up to release wise, that would be great. But the way our space was set up and all the hurdles that we kind of had to jump through just to get to where we're at, that kind of idea went by the wayside. And I don't know, maybe if we get a chance, we can revisit it down the road. But for us, I mean, our build out took a year and a half from when we got the keys to when we finally opened the store. So I couldn't do anything else that was going to possibly push it back even further.
Yeah, that's cool. So since this is about, again, this is the Origins label, and I know you've probably done so many interviews. I saw you just did one on for like the new scene. So I mean, you're probably going to re-answer a lot of the same questions, but there might be a different audience who's going to hear your answers and stuff. And I try to like kind of branch out a little bit outside of that. But I'm trying to think of which question I want to ask first, because I don't know if we're going to segue into each other. But since we're talking about the record store, is there a record store from back in the 90s or something that you remember going to in Massachusetts that like maybe stuck in your brain of, I want to do this someday?
Well, I can tell you. So I'm originally from Central Connecticut, and there was a record store that was kind of like the go-to spot for people near me back then, called Trash American Style. That was the place to go for anything hardcore and punk back then, mid 90s. I remember going there, and they would have stuff that you just couldn't find elsewhere. This is certainly pre-internet, so it was, if you were looking for that early Revelation release that nobody else had, they would typically have it, sort of thing. And remembering that was inspirational to me, not just because it was a store that had cool records that you couldn't find elsewhere, but it was also, a community space. It was something that attracted people that were into the same thing that I was from all over the state, and they would end up there, at different times. And what I'm hoping to do with this space is kind of a similar thing where, you have hopefully cool records and color variants of records that you can't get elsewhere, and T-shirts and stuff that are all a degree of separation away of what Bridge 9 does, but also the stuff that we put out, but also create a place where people that are into that kind of thing can all kind of come to.
Did you, when you went there when you were young, because this is the time, and I just remember when I was 16 and we found the scene in this local scene in New Jersey. We found it because we were playing in a band, and we started going to shows, and some people were just going to shows because their friend was going. So it's like it showed us that there was something that we were looking for that we couldn't put a name to, and we showed up, we're like, oh, this is the spot. So did you find around the same time of you getting into the scene, you found this record store as well, and you were just like, oh my God, like I didn't realize this thing was here for me to like just to live in?
Well, for sure. I mean, think about when you're a teenager, and especially for me, I was kind of on the outskirts of my high school. I had a small group of friends that were skateboarders, and we were kind of on the fringe, certainly not in with the kind of like the popular kids and the people that were kind of in a lot of ways outsiders. And when you go to another town to see bands play, or if you go to a record store, it's an opportunity to connect with other kids that are kind of cut from a similar cloth. And I mean, they say find your tribe. I mean, that was kind of eye-opening for me because back then in the mid 90s and early 90s, when you're in your local high school and your local, your hometown, the only people that really traveled outside of their town back then were people that were skateboarders, people that were, because you're always looking for that good skate spot, and maybe it's 2 towns away or in the city that you're near, or people that were into hardcore and punk and seeing bands play. So then they would travel to other cities and towns throughout the state and in neighboring states to see bands play, or people that were on like intramural sports, right? Those were like the only people that had friends or knew people from other towns. And so for me, that was a time where, you're connecting, like you kind of live in your own little bubble in middle school and the early years of high school. And then you start to connect with other people. I mean, now I think it's a lot easier to connect with like-minded people through social media. But obviously back then it was like you physically had to go find these people, and skate spots, record stores, venues, those were the places.
So I read that you lived in Salem, and then did the record label, you don't have to like go too deep into it, but did you live in Salem and the record label existed there? Or I thought there was another spot in Boston, in Mass, that you lived.
The label started when I was going to college in Vermont, and I was bouncing between Vermont and Central Connecticut, where I'd gone to high school. 2 years after starting the label, 2.5 years, I moved to Boston. And it was in a series of apartments, and kind of bedrooms was where I kind of ran the label for the first, I think, 4 years. And then in the early 2000s, I joined a collective of other Boston area labels that had a space right next to Fenway Park. And that was shared with Big Wheel Recreation, Hydra Head Records initially. The three of us were in there. We were also the Kenmore Agency booking, which was Matt Pike, ran his booking agency out of the space after Big Wheel left and went to the West Coast. And we also had a PR company called Black and White PR. The woman that ran that, Jen Malone, is still crushing it with music. She curates the music for a lot of popular, like kind of Netflix shows, like Wednesday, that show that's out right now, and Yellow Jackets. And,
Shit, Yellow Jackets.
Yeah, she's like doing really high level stuff, which is very cool to see. And I think Doghouse Records had kind of their East Coast guy that was out of that space briefly as well. So we were in there for a couple of years, and then moved to Salem. I moved to an apartment in Salem from Boston, and then moved the office to Salem. So we shared that space with Matt Pike's booking agency, and then also the Death Wish record label for 4 years. And in 2007, ended up moving over to Peabody, one town over. We were there for 14, and then finally just landed now in Beverly, which I'm hoping will be our forever home.
So to kind of go back to how the label starts, I guess like where I was trying to lead to with when you're living in Connecticut and then you're in Salem, for some reason I was thinking, the dots I was connecting was you had this great record store in this scene, and then somehow you were stripped from there and then landed in Salem, and you're like, oh fuck, I missed this. I should probably start making it myself. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it kind of works like that when you're at college. Like when you're at college, were you trying to, like, as soon as you land there, are you trying to immediately find where the scene is that you can start going to shows and things like that?
Yeah, so moving to Vermont was kind of a big part of the reason why I started the label, because I had grown up in this kind of very tight, active scene in central Connecticut, and now I was 3 hours north in the middle of Vermont, about an hour south of Burlington. When I first moved there, I mean, there are vibrant scenes in that area. I mean, Burlington has a very cool scene. It wasn't fully on my radar at first, right? I mean, I started going to shows in Burlington, but I didn't really know anybody there yet. So a lot of that scene was still foreign to me at the beginning. I would also go to Albany, because that was maybe an hour away, hour and 15. So, I saw a lot of bands that went through Albany in the kind of mid 90s. But being there, it inspired me to start the label because I wanted something that connected me to my hometown scene. I needed something that would send me back to Connecticut to be kind of more of a participant. Because prior to that, I had just, I'd been a spectator. All my friends were in bands. I would go to shows with them and hang out, but I didn't really do anything. And I've always had this kind of desire to be proactive and do something. And I think that is a trait that a lot of people in the punk scene have. And I think it attracts people that have that. That's why there's so many people that kind of try and start their own thing, I think, in hardcore and punk. So that's what inspired me to start the label.
Do you remember the day or the moment where you were just like, you were kind of throwing the idea around and you're like, I'm just gonna do it now?
When I was in Vermont, I was at a really small school, 500 kids. It was a college called Green Mountain College. That's no longer a school anymore. They went out of business. But it was a remote, small liberal arts school. And I was very fortunate to find a couple other people that were really into the kind of same East Coast hardcore punk scene that I was into. They were a couple of years older than I. One was from New Jersey, one was from New York. And they had great record collections. We connected that first semester right away. They were both 2 years older than I. It was cool to fall into things with them early on. And they were the ones that were like, hey, you should put out a record. Friends of mine from my high school had started labels. And so I wasn't, I was familiar with the idea of doing it, and I knew people that were doing it, but I hadn't really considered it myself at first. And they had kind of thrown it out there. And I was like, you know what? Sure. I mean, I've already done, like, I was helping my friends' bands make their demo tapes and designing their covers and drawing artwork for buttons and T-shirt designs. I just hadn't done anything on a record level. I was like, yeah, let's do it.
Wait, were you a graphic designer? Were you going to school for that?
Yeah, I was going to school for graphic design. So
okay, that totally makes sense.
That definitely helped kind of getting started.
What program, just because I do graphic design and animation, like what programs were you using back then?
So back then it was Photoshop, I think, because this was 95, 96. I mean, maybe it wasn't Photoshop at first. Everything back then was really just cut and paste. A lot of the things that I was doing was I was using photocopiers and just like enlarging the images and shrinking them down on photocopiers. So like for T-shirt designs or like a button design, I would draw something big and then just shrink it down as small as I can make it on a photocopier, and then take that print, put it back on the photocopier, and shrink it down even further to kind of make it smaller. And that's how, like, when I would make my first catalogs for Bridge 9, that's how I would feature the T-shirt designs, by just shrinking them down on a photocopier, cutting them and pasting them, and then making copies off of that.
What was like your design style? Because a lot of hardcore, pretty much the majority of hardcore, just has this big varsity font or like impact, like Helvetica, like thick like font. Did you find like your graphic design style match that, or did you have your own kind of take on it? And then when you started doing the label, it made it stand out a little bit more, where people were like, "Oh, this is interesting."
I don't know if I was directly inspired by what was already out there at the time, but I can't say that it was too much of a departure early on. I mean, a lot of the design when you're first getting started is just being very easily inspired by what else is going on. And I think it takes a little while for you to get comfortable with your own style. And I think for me, that was probably similar. And I was also handicapped by just not really having the access to the software, because now that I think about it, I don't think Photoshop would have been until maybe a year or two later for me. So it was very just whatever fonts that I had accessible to me. I think there was a very limited palette.
I feel like that's going to work in your favor if you can do, the artwork I'm just trying to think of as a business, how you can save money and things like that. So, but also where you can be stressed out if you're doing too much. So when you start the label, are you basically just controlling every aspect of it, from artwork and, obviously signing the bands and all that stuff? But I mean, were you doing everything basically?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I did everything for at least the first 6 or so years. I think we got our first intern maybe in 2001. And the label started in 95, so everything was done by me in the early years, and it seemed like a lot, right? I mean, looking back now, it's almost like it was a glorified hobby. Like, and I laugh at like what I would later do and the workload I would later take on. Like, I joke that had I taken on this kind of level of responsibility in my first couple of years, I just would have been flattened. But you build up a tolerance for it, and you get better at multitasking and becoming more efficient. But when I look back at the 90s and what Bridge 9 was doing, I mean, it really was almost kind of a glorified hobby, only putting out one 7-inch record a year,
Yeah, I'm noticing that.
very minimal support. We didn't make our first promotional posters, I think, until 2000. All of our catalogs back then were just photocopy sheets that I would fold around a sticker and drop in the mail to somebody if they sent me $1. The ads that I was taking out were quarter page, 6th page, tiny little things in MRR or Heart Attack or, other like kind of regional and more local fanzines. I remember I took out one ad in the Victory Records catalog, I think in 97. And that straight up, I received responses from the entire world from that. That was the wildest thing. I mean, put out this like little tiny, it was a half size catalog that they put out. So, it's like a little 5.5 by 8.5 little fold over catalog. And I had this tiny little Bridge 9 ad with this anime straight edge design that was one of Bridge 9's first things that we had made. I think we had one 7-inch out and a t-shirt and a sticker or something. And I heard from people literally in every country, every state, letters from everywhere, which was very cool.
Did that kind of give you a little bit more juice to want to keep it going? I mean, there's always these milestones when you're doing something that just reinvigorates you. Was that something that you were like, holy shit, I'm onto something?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you start getting letters from people all over the country. And at the time, I was just focused on my little kind of local hometown scene. The only place you could really get my records were at local shows. I was sending some to some of the bigger distros at the time, but I mean, they were taking 10 copies and paying me 4 months later if and when they sold. So it's not like you could go to any record store and find my releases back then. You really had to get them from me either through our mail order or at a local show. But now getting letters from people in Kansas and Arizona and Texas and California. And then I remember getting the first letter from somebody in Belgium. I mean, that was just wild to me because I started getting pen pals and people that were writing to me. Because back then everything was mail order and people would send you a letter, right? With $10 in it, or, if it was $1 or $2.
Well, hidden cash.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, hidden cash. I mean, it's funny. I remember, I keep everything. And I found a few years ago, I found a fanzine that had like $20 stuck in it that I completely missed somehow. And I was like, oh my God. Like, so I'm sorry. There's some kid in like Belgium that's like, what happened to my 7-inch order? My teacher had no idea. People would hide. I remember they would hide like a $20 bill in they would slide it in behind the pages so that it was almost like one of those postcards that like are in magazines that you'd kind of rip out, and it would be like a $20 bill. They would not just send you the money and an order. They would also write to you and tell you about their hometown scene and tell you about the bands that they were friends with. And then I would write to them, and there was a lot more communication between just fans.
Just to jump ahead for a second, and because I just want to like live in the present for the moment. I mean, do you still have that experience now with the label?
I do, but it's different. It's through social media. It's people that are reaching out they'll have questions about releases or bands, or they want to tell you about their band or their hometown scene. I mean, so that communication has exponentially grown. But I don't know. I think there's just more of like a romantic kind of like feel for it back then with the written letters. And kids in Europe they write to you, and then there was this understanding that they would want you to cut their stamps off of their letters. And I don't know if you'd ever heard of this, but like that's something that I would do regularly, where kids in Europe, postage was expensive even back then. So they would rub glue on their postage stamps, on their envelope. And then they would expect you to cut their stamps off of their letter and send them back with their order. And then they would wipe off the postage kind of postmark from it and reuse them. And like that was, yeah, that was a way that people kind of, stretched things a little bit and allowed them to communicate further, I guess, for shorter money.
It's so crazy. I mean, those are the things that when you start a record label, you just think, or you start anything, you just, the focus, if you're going to do a label, is I'm going to put music out. But then these little nuances show up, and you're like, I never would have guessed this was something that was happening.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's everybody that's into music, you have a lot of people have limited resources, and if you want to check out more bands, it gets expensive to, especially back then. I mean, one of the things that I've talked about a little bit, and I don't think the average person really is familiar with now, but is like the use of dialers back then. Is that something that you're familiar with at all?
Oh man, people bring that up all the time in this
Okay.
podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was like something that was like a huge hack that allowed people to be able to communicate at a level that they couldn't otherwise. I mean, I remember back then when I was a kid, my parents would talk into a tape recorder at the kitchen table to tell their parents about what we were up to. Back in the 90s and before that in the 80s, you couldn't just pick up a phone and call somebody from out of town and talk to them for a half an hour or an hour because that you couldn't afford that phone bill, right? It was so prohibitively expensive. And if you did want to call somebody, you did it after 9 o'clock or something, or later in the evening. And then if you wanted to talk even longer, you would call them on a Sunday night because that was when the rates were the cheapest. And so my parents would, just have like this tape recorder on the kitchen table, and my sisters and I we'd all sit there and talk about what we were up to that week or that month. And then they'd drop it in the mail and send it to my grandparents, and they would listen to the tape. I mean, that's because it was so expensive to talk on the phone. So having tools like dialers and kind of hacks where you were able to communicate more than you could otherwise afford were so important.
It's funny you saying that. People always talk about Kinkos and how they'd go and just pay 40 cents for like 1,000 copies and shit for their zine or their posters and stuff. And I'm like, man, it's like the punk scene. Like, I feel like it just like brought down certain industries, like Kinkos or
Yeah.
maybe payphones.
Yeah, I mean, payphones were huge. That was obviously a huge hack. I mean, I had a best friend that worked at a Kinko's, and I had unlimited Kinko's cards. So like when I wanted to make flyers, I was able to do that. You couldn't otherwise do it, right? You couldn't afford to make that fanzine or to promote your show if you didn't have somebody that hooked up that opportunity for you.
It was funny. I actually just heard an interview. This is such a side thing, but there's the guy who was on AppSumo. This guy, Noah Kagan, has this podcast, and he interviewed the guy who created Kinko's, and he sold it for like $3 billion or some shit. Or no, I forget he sold it for like a ton of money. And I'm listening to this whole interview, being like, this is, from my perspective, there's how many people went into his stores. And he's like, man, I was stressed out for like 20 years. I was like constantly just like worried about this whole industry. I'm like, yeah, I wonder how many punks were going in there just like fucking with your store.
I'm sure there was a ton of them, but at the end of the day, I mean, he had the last laugh, right? Like, these industries are so massive and so big. I mean, I'm not crying for any telecom industry, business, because I was making phone calls at a payphone in my college dorm. The first phone call that I made to ask somebody else at another label about where I should start was made using a dialer. And the guy that I called, Scott Bybin, who did Bloodlink Records, he had made the dialer. And my friend was friends with his brother, and the dialer had made its way to him and was now in Vermont. And so anytime I needed to make a long distance call, I used that dialer.
Wait, what was the guy's name? Because people have said it this whole time, but I've never known the person who created this.
Oh, so Scott Bybin, he did a fanzine and a record label. The label was called Bloodlink Records. Really active, interesting guy. And I don't know if he was the one that invented the dialers, but he was the guy that a lot of people got them from in the 90s. So he's, especially if you're talking to people from the 90s and regarding the 90s scene, he would be a really good person to speak with. But he was the first person that I called. I didn't know him. He was older brother of one of these two guys that were, into hardcore and punk at my college, and had put out a bunch of records through his label. And I had a few of his records in my collection, so I was familiar with it. And I mean, when you're trying to start a label or you're trying to do something, you have to seek out other people that have done it, because especially back then, there was very little information available for how to get started. And that's the hardest part, is that knowledge. Most of what we do is not rocket science. It's not that hard to do, but you need to just know that it's possible and kind of wrap your head around it. And the easiest way is usually finding somebody that has done it before and kind of getting some insider tips from them.
I mean, I think the biggest thing that I've learned from listening to labels, like I talked to Rama from Big Wheel and shit like that.
Oh,
and
huge influence on me. And I mean, he was my first person that was really almost a mentor for Bridge 9 early on.
I believe he talked about it. Bridge Nine's come up a bunch, and I believe he talked about it. I was like, I forget who was talking to, but I was like, I think the biggest thing as a label that you don't really realize is like your biggest thing is you basically have to become a fucking babysitter to like a lot of
Yeah.
bands and dealing with us. Like, I mean, just how many different personality clashes are happening. Some bands are probably great, but then other bands are just because it's this emotional thing that they're doing where you're like, okay, I just spent a lot of money on this release. Can you guys stop fighting and go tour so we can actually sell some of this shit?
Yeah, I mean, as a label, you take a lot of risk and you deal with a lot of personalities. Usually with bands, there's usually like the one go-to person that kind of becomes the person that we as a label we deal with, and they kind of act as a representative of the band. With bands, especially early on, when you're the person in the band. I mean, I in the earlier days, I would go on the road with bands. I got to know everyone, and would have my own personal kind of experiences and relationships with these other people on a level that I don't necessarily have as much these days, because I'm not in the tour van as certainly as much as I ever was.
So I'm looking at the first couple years, and like you said, you put out a 7-inch, 96, 97, 98, and 98 you do something else again, and 99 nothing, just one thing. Then by like 2001, that you just start really just putting out a lot of stuff. So like leading up to you just putting out more stuff, like what were some of the growing pains that like some stories or just some things you remember that went wrong in those first couple of years that helped you develop the following years?
So in the early years, it's really not having much momentum, right? I was an unknown person for the most part. There was nobody really going out of their way to get to know me outside of just my circle of friends. So when you start your label, you kind of and you don't really know a lot of people. You just kind of have to go out there and try and connect with people. It's a slow process. I wasn't like an established dude that people knew when I started the labels. It was years of just kind of earning people's trust and kind of building a track record to be able to do bigger things, and focusing on building awareness for what I was doing. I mean, I was going to every show. I was setting up a little merch table at the back of the club whenever I could. Whenever I would go to a show with friends' bands, I would help them with their merch. I would set up a bunch of the Bridge 9 stuff. In the early years, I maybe had one or two records, but I had like 4 or 5 different T-shirts and stickers and canvas patches that we were screen printing and selling to just kind of build awareness for the name of the label and what we were doing.
Was that stuff like keeping you afloat? I mean, I'm guessing you also had a second job on top of this.
Oh yeah, yeah. None of this was necessarily paying the bills. I mean, it helped, right? Like I'd sell T-shirts, and then the money from the sale of those shirts would go into whatever the next record was putting out. But from like day one, I had to figure out side hustles to come up with the money to put out those records, because I mean, you sell 3, 4, 5 T-shirts, back then for $10, and they're costing you I mean, you're making 20 bucks, $25, $30. So like it's but if you're putting out, the first record, I mean, each of those first releases were 1,000 copies. They might have cost, I don't know, $1,000 out of your pocket. And when you're 19, 20, 21, being able to cough up $1,000 back then was tough. And knowing that you're not going to see it for a long time, right? I mean, you might get those records in. I mean, now it takes a year to get a record turned around, but back then it might have been 6 weeks. And you get the record in, and you're selling them at shows, and you make $50 here, $100 there. Then you send copies to a distro, and you got to wait months at the minimum to be able to get paid for them.
Or not get screwed by them. I've heard a bunch of labels talk about they're just like, yeah, and then the distros would just not pay you, and you're like, what the fuck? Yeah.
Well, so you back, especially early on, Bridge 9 had no track record, so we were the lowest priority for anyone to circle back to. So, you have to be the squeaky wheel. You have to be the one going and saying, hey, how are those records selling? Do you need more? And, oh, by the way, can you pay me for the last batch? And, and I had a good experience with I think most, if not all, the distributors I worked with back then. But again, I was like the smallest of potatoes. Like I was just, can you take 20 copies? Can you take 30 copies of some of these records?
I don't know why I'm thinking this, but for some reason I think that the hardcore scene would be easier to manage as far as people goes? I know I made my comment before about babysitting and stuff, but I'm thinking of the emo bands and stuff that came out in the 2000s and it was a fashion show. Like, I feel like they were a giant pain in the ass. But for some reason, again, you've had a ton of bands, so you can go back and forth. But I don't know, I feel like there's a little bit more of this unity in the hardcore scene across the board. I mean, is that, I don't know. It just seems like it's something just kind of popped to my head. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, we've worked with bands, and we've also seen firsthand, not necessarily bands we've worked with, but like there's certain kinds of bands that are out for themselves, and then there's certain kind of bands that all work together. And as a label, we would try to find artists that could work together and tour together and kind of promote each of their efforts. So like, when a new record comes out, everybody on the roster is all excited and trying to push them. So, as a label, we would not look for just random artists to sign. I mean, we would try to kind of find a good band and then work with their friends and and work with the bands that they toured with. I found that really kind of helped unify a lot of artists together. And it was definitely like a, rising tide lifts all boats kind of scenario where everyone would benefit.
Would your bands on your label come together and help promote that new band?
For sure. I mean, it'd definitely be something where when a new release would come out, that they would either promote the new release or, build awareness for it, or take those newer bands out on tour. There was a lot of package tours with Bridge 9 bands together earlier on. Not so much in the 90s, because, I mean, we were really just only working with local bands that only kind of toured within a state or two. But as the label started to grow and we started to get more momentum, we would have bands that would do larger tours and kind of as a collective.
So what turns on the juice in 2001 where you start just cranking out releases?
So the big thing, I mean, I think there was maybe four different things that kind of happened at the same time. The first being that we had a band that was willing to tour outside of their kind of local scene, which was American Nightmare. They were my roommates. At the time, I was living with Wes and Tim, Wes being the vocalist and Tim writing the music. We all lived together in a Mission Hill apartment. At the time, I mean, Tim was the guitarist that had just ended his run with 10 Yard Fight, and the band had just broken up. And Wes was a roadie for 10 Yard Fight and hadn't really done much. He had been in a couple of bands, I think in Portland, Maine, where he had been living prior to moving to Boston, but hadn't done a lot at a larger level. So when they wanted to put out a 7-inch, I mean, it was an in-house thing, right? I had already put out maybe 6 releases. I think the first American Nightmare 7-inch was our 7th. And it was just like, hey, would you be cool if I put it out? And they're like, yeah, let's do it. Having a band that was willing to tour was important. The second one being Rama Mayo of Big Wheel Recreation. I had just started working with Big Wheel. I was really into promoting Bridge 9 on almost kind of a guerrilla marketing level. I was painting Bridge 9 onto railroad trestles, kind of like bridges, and I was changing billboards in the Boston area to say Bridge 9, and in a way that, like, I don't know if I sold any more records because of it, but it was just kind of a cool way to work Bridge 9 into the landscape. And I think I was interested in graffiti, early on in high school, and this was just an extension of that. And I know that Rama was really into guerrilla marketing, and I think he saw what I was doing and offered me a job doing marketing for his label. And it ended up being, I didn't work for Big Wheel. Technically, I was working for Lumberjack Distribution, but I was working on marketing for Big Wheel, a little bit for Hydra Head, and a little bit for Doghouse, and kind of became the contact person between those labels and Caroline Distribution, who was kind of the bigger distributor for Lumberjack artists that were, in labels.
I'm looking at your Instagram because I have a bunch of tabs open, and I'm seeing the picture you have with the Bridge 9 BHC 1999 on the Charles River.
Dude, that was it. So I painted
Sick.
That overnight in the summer of '99, and it was, so that bridge is it always has something written on it. I went there one night with a 5-gallon bucket of white paint and just whitewash the whole side of the bridge. I think it probably took me 2 hours with a roller and just whitewash the whole thing. And then we went back with black paint and like a smaller roller and wrote that out. It was up for months. I mean, like something like 100,000 people drive down the kind of the main road that goes by. I mean, it was just funny. I mean, I don't know if it really helped Bridge 9 in terms of, selling any other records, but a lot of people saw it. And a lot of people that knew what was up with it or familiar with what Bridge 9 was got a kick out of it. But that was up for months. So I was doing things like that to kind of help promote Bridge 9 because I had no money to take out ads. I was even making my own subway ads. So like in every subway train on like the Green Line in Boston, they would have these square kind of like 2.5 foot by 2.5 foot printed ads that you could just slide up into a built-in frame. And I was making those at my job at Tower Records. So I worked in the art department at Tower Records in Boston on Newbury Street prior to working at Big Wheel. So I would go and design these like just black and white ads promoting like 7 inches that I was putting out. And then I would go onto the and take these trains and go up and down the Green Line and just slide them in, in the train, kind of these train frames. And again, I don't know if it really sold any other records or brought any additional awareness to the label, but it was just one additional way for me to be able to promote what I was doing, like really on the cheap.
Do you do anything like that nowadays, like any kind of guerrilla style stuff with marketing the label now?
A little bit, but not to the level that I want to. I do have a bunch of ideas for some projects that I'm working on for down the road that will have a return to that style. But it's one of those things where I had nothing to lose back then. I had to climb up the back of a building with wheat paste, and I'm like wheat pasting over a billboard, at 2 a.m. in the summer of '99. I had nothing to lose. I had no assets, it's something that I could get away with back then. I think I'd have more trouble explaining myself at almost 47 than back then.
Yeah, I do this web comic, and I'll try to find like Sticker Mule always has these weekly deals where you can get like 50 stickers for $9 or like, magnets and shit. So I would start getting that stuff, and I'm like, man, I'm a 43-year-old guy. I don't really want to be getting a fine for graffiti. So I'd find ways where I'd get magnets and put them on metal posts around town, or actually this one is probably more, I created like a stamp on Zazzle for the character, and I would like find like these white smooth concrete sidewalks and just kind of like go out and like step on it, and it would just like imprint into the concrete where after 3 months of raining it finally will go away. But there's like this, I always wanted that. I mean, I grew up with Obey being a big thing, and like that whole street graffiti thing was awesome, and I was like, man, I always wanted to do that. But as an adult, I'm like, I'm not gonna pay a fine for this, or maybe get arrested for doing this shit.
No, if you can find a cool way to do it that's not as permanent, So I made, years ago, this was probably whenever QR codes came on the scene, I made stickers that were just a QR code, and I gave them to a guy that was working for me. And now he was working at this clothing brand, it's a sports clothing brand, and had a law degree. But this was in a time where, it was harder to get a good law like job opportunity out of school. And so he was working with me in the interim, and I gave him some of these stickers, and he was going to a Red Sox game. I was like, hey, just throw a couple of these on the back of stop signs, when you're down there, and we'll see if we get any traction from it. The first sticker he put up, he got collared by the cops. Like legit, like this is a dude that went to law school, was just like, oh yeah, cool, I'll throw a couple stickers up, as a favor. Literally the first sticker he put on the back of a sign, cops caught him. Nothing happened, but they took down his info, and they were going to write a letter to his, wherever he was living. And like, he was like, it was like a warning, but like, he felt like an idiot. And it was just dumb. We can laugh about it now. But early on, a lot of the things that I was trying to do was, so like when 10 Yard Fight had their last show in '99, in '99, you can see as a theme for when I was doing a lot of guerrilla marketing, I was stenciling the date of the show and the details, the venue and whatnot, and we were spray paint stenciling them on sidewalks. And I would do friends of mine and I would go, and one would be on one corner of like Newbury Street, one would be on another, and they'd kind of be lookouts, and then I'd be in the middle spray painting this on sidewalks. Or even back then, remember I was a woman I was dating. We would go and we called them sticker dates, and she would kind of like be a lookout while I would go put some of Bridge Nine's earliest promotional stickers for releases we were putting out on the back of signs. I mean, some of those stickers were up for a decade. The promotional opportunities should not be understated by taking the initiative to do stuff like that.
Yeah, I love that. Real quick, if you haven't signed up for the Patreon, it's over at patreon.com/thiswasthescene. It's $1 a month, and now I will let you go back to listening to this. At what point do bands start contacting you to want to be on the label?
So after American Nightmare's first record came out, so I told you there was a few things that kind of had to happen in tandem, and one being a band that was willing to tour, one being having the structure and guidance to help really release the record in the manner that it needed to be released. So I was working at Big Wheel. Rama was accessible to me. He was someone that had put out a bunch of records on Big Wheel already. He had started his label a year prior to mine, but had gotten a lot more momentum right out the gate, more than I had. So he was a great resource for just picking his brain or getting advice for how to handle things. So, now all of a sudden I had a release that was available everywhere. You didn't have to find me at the Middle East to buy a copy of my record or mail order. You could get it in record stores across the country. But the really big piece of the puzzle that helped was coming up with the resources to be able to do it. And I've talked about it a little bit, on some podcasts recently, but basically I had to find the money to invest in Bridge Nine and our releases because I didn't have it, right? I didn't have a car. I didn't have any sort of equity. I couldn't get a loan. And I tried. I went to banks and was like, hey, I have this record label and I have all these bands. And they would literally just stare at me and I'm in my jeans and sneakers and be like, you want how much? I would go in and say, I need $20,000. And they're like, okay, who's your distributor? Well, I don't really have a distributor. Where's your record store? Well, it's at my apartment. There was no opportunities for traditional funding. And this was before many years before crowdfunding and what have you. So I had to figure out a way to make the money elsewhere. And that was kind of a theme that I had for many years. So when Bridge Nine's first few records, not the first one, but maybe like the third, fourth, were paid for by selling bumper stickers that I was wholesaling to Hot Topic. And, it was kind of subculture themed. I think the first one just said, I love ska with like a black and white checkered heart as like the heart. It wasn't something, I wasn't a ska fan, but I was just like, I'd gone to Hot Topic and a friend of mine worked it was like the manager at one. And I was meeting up with him. We were going to go out to dinner after he closed up. And I was just walking around the store while he was, doing whatever he had to do and looking in this glass counters. And there's all these corny bumper stickers. And I'm like, I can make these. So he got me the info. I called the buyer and was like, hey, can I submit some designs to you? And they're like, yeah, sure. I sent them to them and they started buying them. And they started buying thousands of them. I think that I Love Ska one, I think I sold 2,000 or 3,000 of them. But then there was other ones that I was selling upwards of 10,000 stickers over a couple of years. That was my first real opportunity to be like, oh, wow, I can make a lot more money than I would at my day, not my day job, but my part-time college job. And I can take that and then put it into the label. I was able to fund some of the early records by doing these kind of random bumper stickers. And around the fall of '99, friends of mine and I started seeing what was happening at Fenway Park because the rivalry with the Yankees and Red Sox was palpable. Yankees suck was like the chant you heard.
Yeah, they had a 30 for 30 about those guys.
They did. Well, and I was interviewed at length for that podcast, and my contribution was cut. So
were you part of that whole crew?
I was.
Get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, and the Grantland there was another article about it that predated the 30 for 30, and there's a photo of the whole crew, and I'm right in the center holding a Yankee Suck sign, but I contributed my story to both of those publications, and it was cut out of it. But which is fine. There was another person in the mix that lobbied hard to kind of tell his perspective. So I haven't had the same opportunities to kind of talk about what I was doing. we basically, I mean, went down to Fenway Park, sold Yankee Suck merch from like the spring of 2000, and sold a lot of it. I mean, made so much money doing that. And for me, I was able to funnel everything that I was earning into the label. So that's like at
crazy.
first, yeah, I mean, first American Nightmare had whatever they needed. And they were my first band where like, oh, promotional posters, full color printed, like designs, we've got vinyl, we've got CDs, we have, we kind of like did everything we needed to do and gave it every bell and whistle. And they obviously were an incredible band and are an incredible band and made a big splash right immediately. And a lot of bands at that time were like, oh shit, who's Bridge Nine? Like, oh, like check out all the things that they're doing with American Nightmare. And for a while, I mean, any band I wanted to, I was able to work with, because a lot of the labels of the 90s that had kind of dominated what Bridge Nine had kind of grown into doing, for whatever reason, there'd been kind of a turning point in like 2000, 2001, where a lot of those dependable labels that would have put out American Nightmare or would have put out a lot of the bands that I ended up working with were just not really looking at hardcore bands. So there was kind of a space for me to grow into very quickly. So that was an opportunity to now all of a sudden sign all these bands that would have had gone with these other labels and put them all in Bridge Nine. So in the early 2000s, 2001, 2002, 2003, we had, a pretty stacked lineup with not a lot of competition at that level. So we were able to grow very quickly. I mean, I was making $1,000 a night early on outside of Fenway when I had only been making $500 every 2 weeks at my day job. Right. So like now all of a sudden it's just, and I would have 10 games in a row in a homestand. And it was just like, oh, wow. Like we're able to make a lot of money and pay whatever bills we need to pay. And I'm saying we, but it was me at the time, to allow a lot of these artists to be able to do whatever they wanted, work with whatever, studio they want to work with whatever mastering house they wanted or designer for the artwork, and then start doing things like ads in bigger magazines. When we signed Terror, in 2002, I bought their first tour van with like bumper sticker money. We were selling Yankee Suck bumper stickers, and I was able to go buy them a van. That allowed me to invest a lot into the artists that I was working with, and that because of that, other bands saw that attention that these bands were getting, and came to me to work with me as well.
When you said you bought the van for Terror, did you do things like that a lot, or did you kind of do that in the beginning and then find out later on, like, I think I should kind of pull back a little bit?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, there was not a lot of tour vans bought back then, or even now. I mean, that was just like I think we were trying to sign them, and it was something that they needed, and it was something that I don't think the other label that was kind of vying for them at the time was able or willing to do. It helped us get that done.
I'm thinking about how the majority of your bands, the theme is hardcore, right?
Yep.
Okay, so are you like bumping heads at all with like Victory at this point, at any point?
No, so we never did ever. And in the early 2000s, Victory, Revelation, Equal Vision, all incredible labels that really had a significant contribution to the kind of music that we were working with, all for whatever reason were not really looking at these hardcore bands. I mean, American Nightmare sent their first demo to Equal Vision, and they passed on them. They, of course, later worked with them when they realized there was something. But, you really had to see American Nightmare to know their potential back then. And like that first demo was kind of rough. And, I think a lot of those labels had kind of cut their teeth putting out up and coming hardcore bands. And we're now, I think, seeing a little more success with more indie stuff, more metal stuff, or things that were not specifically traditional hardcore. Like I said, it left a void open that I was able to fill.
So I had Alex on the podcast. He's the drummer for American Nightmare. He was in Baby Gopal, like back in the day.
Yep.
And I brought up when they changed their name, because I remember in 2003 or 2002 when they had changed their name, because they were on tour with Glassjaw, and I saw them in LA at like the Troubadour or something like that, or some other venue. And I think they were American Nightmare, or they just changed their name to Give Up the Ghost. And so when that happened, I mean, this seems like they were kind of a pretty relevant band on your label. Did that have an effect on like their releases for a while?
So by that time, they had been signed by Equal Vision. We put out two singles for them, one in 2000 and one in 2001. And then later, 2001, their first full-length album came out on Equal Vision. And sometime shortly after, they changed to, I think it was first to American Nothing, because they were trying to keep the AN as kind of their, I mean, they'd sold so many AN sweatshirts, I think, by that point, that they wanted to keep that relevant. And for whatever reason, the band that they were kind of butting heads with, one of the members worked at a law firm. So they had unlimited legal, kind of like assistance to protect this trademark that they had been able to file, this kind of cover band in Philly. American Nightmare, tried to work with them on some level, and they were kind of hardline about it. I think because of how things had started, I guess. They had been contentious early on between the two bands. They ended up having to settle on give up the ghost.
Do you so from your perspective, if you had one of your bands that had the name first and then you guys found out that another band had the name, would you have gone after them the same way to get them to change their name?
It really depends on the situation. I mean, we've had some bands where it just wasn't worth it. Unless you have in-house like legal counsel, it can be very expensive, prohibitively expensive to kind of fight these battles. And it's never worth it, I think, for most of the people that are in the mix. There's obviously the lawyers that end up benefiting the most. And there's been little things like, we worked with a band in 2001 called 2002 called Sworn In. In the later 2000s, some American band called Sworn In started, and it's like, I don't know, who gives a shit? We didn't really do anything about that.
Do you think that works in your favor though? Like when you have another band out there with a name, even though like it might get someone to accidentally find your band?
I think that might have been the mindset at the time. It's like, all right, well, cool. Like if more people are gonna be looking, for this band and they find our band, I mean, we were on it first, so then go for it.
Well, it's kind of like that band that was suing Blink 182 as when they were just Blink, and then they became Blink 182. So people were like, "What's this other Blink band?" And then they bought this record, and they're like, they probably got them this giant boost in sales,
Yeah.
And then they realized it was shit.
Yeah, that's the risk they're on.
So what's like the day to day in the 2000s? Well, actually, no. Before I ask that, and I always talk about this because there's the basic theme. Not the basic structure I usually do with interviews is like the origins and then that hump in the 2000, how it affected the label and all that. So it's a repetitive question I ask all the time, but I still think it's very relevant because everyone had a different perspective. When Napster comes into play, how did you see that?
So when Napster came into play and when LimeWire and all these digital kind of downloading situations started happening, I mean, that was right when Bridge 9 was getting its feet underneath it. And that was the lowest possible place in the music industry, right? I mean, the music industry was at its lowest level in, I think, 2000 when American Nightmare came out. And it was tough to get, it was tough in a lot of ways because if the number of bands that I was working with in the early 2000s, had that happened 5 years earlier, Bridge 9 would have had just like incredible exponential growth. I mean, we did have some great, incredible growth, but like the level of what the business would have become would have just been insane because back then people were buying the records and there was just more opportunities as a label. And that just wasn't the case for us. And we just had to adapt and we were able to put out a ton of records and do a lot of things. But the value of what we were doing was, I think, was minimal, and it didn't start growing in terms of the music industry for like another 10 years. It was tough. I mean, I remember going, a lot of distributors that went out of business because of it. Our distributors were, whenever we would go visit them, you could see kind of the look of fear in some of these people's eyes because they didn't know if they were going to lose their job. We've worked with Caroline Distribution for a long time, and I mean, I remember in the mid to later 2000s going into their office in New York and seeing just like a field of cubicles that were empty. And I'm sure they were filled with people selling records and promoting bands 5 years earlier. And it just kind of things were kind of like getting pulled back.
Did you like mentally start thinking about shit, if this goes wrong, I really need to start setting myself up to do something different?
I've always been in the mindset of kind of not putting all your eggs in one basket, and I think for me that was a lot of the idea behind having this second brand with Sully's. So like, going back to the opportunity that we had selling merchandise to Boston sports fans, after a couple of years, we realized this is actually a better business than putting out records. And the amount of opportunity and growth that I was seeing with what I was doing with sports fans was growing faster than the label. So for the first few years, it was just an ends to a means. I would go out and friends of mine and I would sell this stuff, and we would take all that money and go and invest it in the bands. But after 3 or 4 years, realize, wait, there's actually a business here. So instead of being this kind of shadow, kind of like on the side job, it became its own brand. So I branded it Sully's. We started making an effort to get Sully's products in local stores and built a website and like built its own kind of mail order business around what had only been available for sale in the streets outside of Fenway Park for several years prior to that. For the next 20 years, both of the brands existed in each of our offices. So when we were in Salem with Death Wish, there was a whole Sully's section. When we were in Peabody and then moving here to Beverly, we've kind of had these brands existing side by side. So like you would go into our warehouse and like one whole side would just be hardcore and punk and black t-shirts. And then the other side was shamrocks and red and blue and green and black and gold t-shirts, things that kind of like resonate with Boston sports fans. And there's kind of a line down the middle.
Was there any like, I mean, I'm just thinking this because of Boston in general, and you said Newberry. I'm thinking of Johnny Cupcakes. Did you have any like inspiration from that guy or connection with that guy when the whole shirt thing started to happen?
No, so our shirt thing, I think, kind of what we were doing kind of happened around the same time. In fact, I remember he would come into our office when we were in Boston and bring care packages to Matt Pike and Matt Galley, who were pretty prominent booking agents back then for a lot of bands. In fact, like Matt Galley still works with like My Chemical Romance but was working with them back then. And he would bring Johnny Cupcakes t-shirts to give to them and to, try and give to the bands. So I've been able to watch his growth and he and I have been in touch over the years, and we'll trade vendor leads or brainstorm, here and there. We've collaborated. We had one of our artists perform in one of the stores years ago. Yeah, he's an incredible self-built kind of started from a backpack and grew into a national brand story that I've always appreciated.
Well, it's funny. I'm just thinking the connection there too, because he was huge into guerrilla marketing, where he just would theme things, and that would get people's attention. And like you do the same in a different aspect. But then like he's from the hardcore scene, you're from the hardcore scene. He's straight edge. I don't know, and like the shirt thing. I was like, well, there must have been. I'm like, you guys have to know each other. So it sounds like I was right.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely something in the water here. I mean, because there's so many. I mean, Boston seems to be a breeding ground for so many cool businesses, whether it's labels. I mean, the number of labels that have come out of the Boston area is crazy. And a lot of them start here and then move elsewhere. I mean, Big Wheel moved to the West Coast and Hydra Head moved to the West Coast. And unfortunately, both labels aren't really as active, or, I think they're both kind of doing little things here and there now, which is great to see. But like, I mean, we had one of my employees started a label called Top Shelf. And
I love Top Shelf.
Yeah, I mean, he started just like as an intern and then worked, his way up, through the years working at Bridge 9 and used our office as kind of like where he started kind of like moving his label from his house in his bedroom kind of thing. Like much as I had with Big Wheel, Seth and Top Shelf did that over at Bridge 9 for several years. And, and then have moved on and have done really incredible things and have like this, put out over 100 something records. It's, I don't know. I think there's something in the water.
Like I was in a band we used to play in Massachusetts, and the scene out there was just fucking great. It was just the kids that would come out. There was just I don't know, they just were always so energetic. So I mean, we saw like a small sample of that where in like the Middle East or in fucking random hall shows and shit. But every time we were up there, like we were like, we have to come back here as much as possible because everyone just kicks so much ass up there.
Well, you know what the cool thing about Boston is that it's a college, city. There are so many schools here that it attracts people from all over. So there's like new blood. I mean, the bad part about that is a lot of those people leave. They don't spend a lot of time here, but people will come, create cool things, create bands, create labels. Like, I mean, I wasn't from Boston originally. A lot of the people that I've known to do really cool things in Boston weren't even from Boston initially, but they kind of planted the seed of whatever it was that they were doing and nurtured it while they were in Boston, and then moved on and took what they had built elsewhere.
So I have to ask this just because this is more for a personal thing. So you had Polar Bear Club on the label.
Yep.
And I remember that Red Leader, didn't they originally put out the Redder the Better? And then got that from them?
So they did. They put it out on CD. So we did a vinyl release for it because it had never been on vinyl or was not on vinyl from that label. And I think at the time that label wasn't active and wasn't doing anything. Shortly after they had put that out, that was something that we worked with the band, and I believe we might have been in touch with somebody at Red Leader because we did their logos on the record that we put out. But it was I think we were giving the band a good amount of momentum at the time, and it was just made sense to keep it going with that release.
Well, it's the reason I asked that question because my band was the first release on Red Leader, so I would.
Okay.
Yeah, and Matt, he's a really famous comic book like writer nowadays. He writes like for Marvel and shit. But I mean, the reason I found out about Polar Bear Club is I was doing a little research. I was just kind of like keeping tabs on Ridley, like what are they up to? And he put out like Strike Anywhere, and there was a lot of bands that Matt just had a really good ear. So when I heard Polar Bear Club, I was like, fuck, these guys are so good. And
So good.
like I loved all the releases. I guess where I'm leading with this is their last release. Did Jim's voice like change, and that's what like led the band to break up? I know it's such a later on, but I've always wondered this.
Was that the record that came out on Rise?
It was like the last release they came out, and it just sounded like his voice just like it just changed or something. So I was like, I never read anything about that, but then soon after that release came out, they were gone. So I was just like wondering if I don't know what the story was behind that.
Yeah, no, I don't think I could weigh in on that, but I know that they had a great run, and I think it's hard to keep everyone on the same page over.
Well, they had a lot of member changes. I remember that they kept going through guys all the time.
Yeah, that's one of the that takes its toll. I mean, I remember even going back to American Nightmare. I mean, I think they had 20 drummers in the first 3 or 4 years.
Oh my God.
So it's really difficult to keep things going, and then you throw in like a lawsuit over the name of the band and anything else. It's hard.
So like when 2000, let's say 2004 to, I'm just gonna jump, let's say 2000, I don't know, 15, let's say. What kind of ups and downs were happening there? Did you find that it just started to just kind of level out where you're like, okay, I can just ride this thing and be creative and still have to get bands and things like that. But was there a point where you were kind of waving like, I don't think I want to do this anymore?
No, so like I've never lost my drive to do the label.
Damn.
Like I've always, yeah. I mean, we're in our 27th year, and like I just love doing it. I love being a part of it. I love finding new bands. Obviously throughout the years, it's hard to maintain the momentum that you have, right? Like, and that's true for anybody. If you're an actor, if you're a band, if you're a label, if you're any sort of business, there's going to be ebbs and flows, and you're going to, as a label, you can really only put out records with the bands that are out there. What you're able to do is almost dictated by what the scene is like and how active it is. And I think in a lot of ways that forces you to be a little more diverse, right? Because like if you're somebody that says, I'm going to only put out straight edge hardcore bands, well, you might have a great run in the late 90s, and then a lot of people break edge and like it's not as cool anymore, and there's not as many good straight edge bands, and then you're like, all right, well, I guess I'm not doing my label anymore. And that happened a lot. I mean, there's a lot of really cool labels that kind of document these brief scenes and all the cool things that happen. And then, everything comes and kind of goes, and then people move on. I've always maintained an interest and focus in what Bridge 9 was doing. So like we just kind of have to shift a little bit here and there. And as the label went, as years go by, my interest in different kind of bands has grown. We, I think, traditionally are seen as a pretty narrow hardcore punk label, but the reality is we've put out a lot of stuff that really wouldn't fit that definition. So if you look at, Lemuria or Candy Hearts or Dave Hawes or like Polar Bear Club, I mean, we've mixed it up, or Alcoa, which is kind of the more acoustic side project of Derek from Defeater. There's been things that are not really fitting the same definition. As you grow as a person and the number of bands that you're open to listening to, the sound of a label can change. But it is funny that people, we've put out over 300 releases. People still think of Bridge 9 as like Nike sneakers and hardcore, straight edge and stage dives. And in a lot of ways we are, but over the years you mix it up a little bit. But at the same time, I do want to stay true to the spirit of where Bridge 9 started. And I mean, I still get excited about stage dives and hardcore, even though I don't really do it as much, anymore. I think at this point, if I jump off stage and I hurt somebody, it'd be pretty embarrassing. So,
or just break your fucking neck.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what a way to go out, or break my hip.
Well, it's funny because when and I'll start wrapping this up soon, but when I saw you guys had signed Newfound Glory in 2009, I guess.
No, so that was 2008 was when I think we committed to it in 2007, and then the record came out. The Tip of the Iceberg record came out in 2000, and I think it was April of 2008.
So I remember when that happened, to me it made sense because of Chad growing up as a singer for Shai Hulud, and
yep.
So when I saw that, I'm like, oh, that's actually that I can see where that works.
Well, and we got a lot of flack for it initially, but we also got a lot of love. I mean, and that's something that we couldn't have done maybe even 2 years earlier. But that band, it was a band of people that were really into hardcore punk that were playing, something a little more melodic. So the spirit of what Bridge 9 was into was in all the members of Newfound Glory. I actually met them back in 2004 I was on tour with the band in Australia, and they had flown in for their own tour and saw that an American hardcore band was playing in like whatever city it was in Australia. So they came out because they had a night off. Their tour hadn't started and they wanted to just hang out, which was very cool of them. So, we all got to meet those guys. At the time, actually, I think shortly after, Chad had reached out to me about to gauge my interest about doing something with their side project, which was the ISHC, like International Superheroes of Hardcore, that they had recorded but hadn't done anything with yet. And to be honest, I think at that time in probably early 2005, I think there was still too much stigma around like the Good Clean Funds and like in the bands that were like just kind of parodies, that I didn't want to do something that wasn't serious. So I initially passed on it. But fast forward to 2007, and we started talking with H2O, and Chad was going to produce that first record that came out on Bridge 9, the Nothing to Prove album. And we started talking again, and the idea of doing I think a few cover songs by Newfound Glory, but of hardcore bands came up. And then we continued to flesh out that idea, and it ultimately became the Tip of the Iceberg record, where it was a few new Newfound Glory songs, some covers, and then like this bonus LP's worth of material of their kind of alter ego hardcore band. But I mean, I can't understate the opportunity to work with Newfound Glory in 2008 and have that release be kind of their first indie release after their time with a major.
MCA, right? That was who they were before. Yeah,
they were. Yeah, I mean, they obviously they were on like Cribs, and like it was a pretty high level band. For us to be able to do something that was really kind of their, at the time, like kind of their love letter to hardcore and punk, it opened up a door for so many new people to come in to see what we were doing as a label. This, the mid 2008. I mean, we started with Newfound Glory, but the next month we had H2O. And then after that, we had Have Heart with Songs to Scream at the Sun, and then Verse, Aggression, and Ceremony. We had so many kind of bangers all in a row. And you'd think that people would come like buy the Newfound Glory record and then peace out, but they all stayed. So we had this huge, I mean, like this really huge wave of new interest in what we were doing with that record. And it carried over for everything that we put out after that. So, that was, for us, it was a really big tipping point where we were kind of able to bring a whole bunch of new people into what Bridge 9 was doing, and they stayed.
When you did Gallows, that was like the shift when the first singer left, right?
Correct. Yeah. He's an absolute incredible vocalist. And it was, I could see why it was a difficult transitional time for the band to lose him and to switch over to a new vocalist. But I mean, they kept it going and were great in their own right. It was just different.
Yeah, as I say, like, I mean, you've had to see so many different things happen with the label just in every aspect. But when you have a band, it's like American Nightmare having to change their name, or fucking Gallows, their singer leaving, and there's some certain releases you probably, and like Newfound Glory, where you're getting this backlash, or it may be just hitting this resistance where you're kind of like, fuck, I just got to weather the storm right now.
Well, it creates a distraction, now instead of the conversation being about this new release, now half the people are talking about, oh, I only like this person singing, and I don't like this. It just kind of, it fractures the audience in a way that it's a shame a lot.
Yeah, I mean, as a fan, you're always going to have I don't know, you're going to lead with your emotions sometimes. Like even now, like even from doing this, some people just like do some YouTube comments where they're like, "Did you really say that Sensefields was a grunge band or something?" And I'm like, I was like, let me go back and listen to it. It was maybe just a joke or something. But people just have their take on it. Where when you're at the core of it, making the thing, you're kind of like, fuck off.
Yeah,
I could just understand where that could be. It seems like you're a pretty humble guy too, where I'm sure like things would annoy you, but I feel like you would kind of just dismiss it and just kind of just keep moving forward.
Well, you soon learn that like, everyone's got their own take, and half of them are uneducated, or half of them tap into something that's completely unrelated. So you just have to move on. I mean, I saw something, recently that I guess had been posted in 2019, and they're like, I hope Bridge 9 calls it quits, for their 25th anniversary, because what are they doing now? And like, the reality is we're continuing to evolve and adapt and change. And we're finding an opportunity to be able to celebrate all of the years that we've been a label, but then also create a space where we can continue to push forward what we're doing as a label, but also celebrate, all the cool stuff that other labels and other bands that are, within kind of our world are doing. The hope is with this store is to build a community space where we can be a physical space where people can come and experience kind of like our take and what we've been into, but then also kind of go on that journey with us for whatever comes next.
How strong of a risk would you take in a genre that has nothing to do with what the label is presented, where you'd say like, if I could have my way, I would go after like this style or this band, even though it might have this negative effect on the label?
It really would depend. I mean, the reality is we try to go out of our lane a little bit, but you can't go too far, because it ends up being a disservice to the band that you're working with, or even the label. There's definitely artists that we've worked with that were, I think, maybe 1 degree of separation too far away, and we didn't really do or weren't able to do what the band, I think, needed. I think it was a novelty for us to do it, and I think it was cool for them, but like maybe a label that was a little closer or a little more in their lane would have maybe been able to do more for them. I mean, I do like to be able to mix it up, because I mean, the reality is I'm into a lot more things. I mean, when I was first starting the label, my focus and perception of what I was into was really narrow. And I think that's the case for a lot of people when they're teenagers. You're like, I only like this, and I'm not going to even entertain that. But as you broaden your interests and start being exposed to other things, what you're into kind of grows. And that's reflected as if you're in a band. I mean, your sound might change a little bit, or as if you're a label, the number of artists you work with goes in different directions. I mean, you've seen that with lots of labels that have been around a long time, that they kind of their sound evolves as they get older as kind of curators. But it also depends on what's going on, right? I mean, like, Revelation documented all this really great kind of in-your-face hardcore in the late 80s, and then the sounds in a lot of ways changed in the early 90s. And if they wanted to just focus on the kind of sound that they did in the late 80s, that might not have been available to them in the early 90s. And so as a label, like, you have to evolve and you have to change. And now you're putting out Into Another and Shelter and Iceburn and things that are different and that maybe aren't an exact reflection of where the label started, but it's where, maybe where it's going.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of some labels like Fearless or Fuel by Ramen or like Hopeless that just really expanded outside of what they originally were. I mean, I guess maybe not so much Hopeless. I'm on their website right now. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, no, maybe not so much Hopeless, but they do have like All Time Low and shit like that. But yeah, like I think some labels, they just shifted to either they just said fuck it and they went with it, or they're like, hey man, this is the keeping this thing alive, and then what we want to do is going to go in this direction, so we're just go there.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. You have to kind of like, if you want to remain viable, you have to continue to kind of like grow with whatever's happening at that time. We've been fortunate to just kind of exist in kind of our space, and some years are cool, some years are less cool, but you just kind of have to know how to balance things so that you can keep going.
All right, so before I wrap it up with two questions, I started asking this recently. Is there a story that you've always wanted to tell that you've never told in another interview that you'd like to tell now?
So there is a story that I've referenced. I have told it a couple times, so I don't know. It's the $500 fist fight to fund the American Nightmare record.
I mean, fuck it. I don't know the story, so screw it. I'd love to hear it.
Have you haven't heard this?
No.
All right, cool. So basically, it was the spring of 2000. We had all started, my friends and I had all started making a ton of money outside of Fenway. I mean, everyone went from having like nothing in their pockets to hundreds of dollars at any one moment. So as you can imagine, people started getting more creative with how they spent that money. And I was actually at my girlfriend's at the time's place and got a phone call from a friend, and he said, "Hey, we're putting together a prize fight for $500. Do you want to come fight someone?" And I later learned that he had volunteered to do it and then like had backed out. So it was on him to find somebody to take his place. And basically I had to leave, and it was like, I don't know, 1 a.m. or midnight or something, and leave and go to this parking lot to fight someone for $500. And I was motivated to do it because I owed $500 to a mastering place for American Nightmare's first record. So I had to like go and try and like come up with this money, because back then everything was you had to go find the money as you needed it. So I went to our friend's house. There was like 15 people waiting, and we all walked down to this parking lot and just squared up at 1 a.m. and fought till one person was standing.
Wait, all 15 of you just
No. It was the 15 people kind of like in a circle watching.
Oh.
And 2 of us kind of had to square up and fight. Full disclosure, I was not particularly known for fighting. It was just an opportunity for 2 random people to square off. But I was lucky, I was fortunate. I ended up winning, and
I kicked the shit out of both of them.
No, it's like any given Sunday. It could have gone either way, but I ended up winning, got the $500. I gave 100 of it to the guy I fought, and then took the rest of it to pay for a money order the next morning to pay for American Nightmare's mastering bill.
Wait, was this with boxing gloves or bare knuckle?
No, bare knuckle.
Jesus.
Yeah. I mean, it was definitely like, I would not do it again. But at the time, it was like, all right, fuck, $500. That sounds cool. Because again, I was making $250 a week. I think, or 250. I think it was maybe $250. Yeah, probably $250 a week back then. So that was like 2 weeks' pay to like just go show up and try. So
Did you, when you were like fighting them in your mind, were you thinking, I have to win because I need this fucking money?
Yeah, well, I need you. You need to win because you need the money, and you also need to save face, right? Like you
Mm.
can't, walk away from that and lose. But to be honest, the guy that lost, like he got a lot of respect for it because nobody else stepped up to do it, and he did, and he didn't win, but like he was a hard ass for doing it.
Has that story carried, did that kind of carry with the label for a little bit?
Yeah, I mean it's something that wasn't on the record a lot, but it's come up here and there,
Jesus
and
Christ. That's intense, man.
it's a reflection of where the label was at that time, and really believing in something and being like and doing whatever it is you have to do to push that forward. I think that's where I was. I was like, look, I need money. This is an opportunity. Let's do it.
Jesus Christ, dude. I was not expecting that story. All right, man. Last two questions before I ask the last one. What would you like to plug? It could be about you. It could be about a friend. It could be about both.
Cool. So I would, obviously I'd love to plug our store, let people know we are 35 minutes north of Boston. We are one town over and about 5 minutes away from Salem. So for people that are, from around the country, if you're visiting Boston, if you're, doing the Salem tourism for, like the kind of witch city stuff, we're very close by. We are also in a community of 5 other record stores. There's 5 stores between Beverly and Salem. So within the two towns, much in the same way that we are kind of curating hardcore and punk, there's a very cool record store just one street over from us called Soundtracks that's really heavily involved in hip hop. In fact, the gentleman that owns it is this guy, George. He's known as 7L from 7L and Esoteric, and he's been in the hip hop scene in the Boston area for over 30 years. So I think a lot of people in Beverly probably don't even realize how cool it is that they have somebody with as many contributions to hip hop as he has in their backyard, kind of curating this record store experience. And then there's another store in Salem that's called Residency that's more metal and kind of stoner rock. The kind of Venn diagram of all, there's a lot of overlap, I think, between those 3 stores. And then there's a couple of used record stores in the area as well. So, make a day of it. If you're in the area, come out, check it out. But just keep that in mind for people that are going to be in the Boston area.
Yeah, and you can also go down the street to DK's ice skate sharpening that I'm seeing.
I don't even know where that is.
I pulled a map up just to see what's around you. There's like Gentile Brewing. You can get your computer serviced at MR Tech.
There are 4 breweries down the street from us.
I can imagine.
And even Death Wish, I don't think their building is open to the public, but their warehouse is one street behind us, which is kind of funny considering we had shared 4 years like in the same room, for us to now be in the same neighborhood again, which is very cool.
Yeah, I saw that too on the map when I pulled that up. Is like Death Wish was right there. I was like, I wonder if this is the same one.
It is, and it's cool because like they're helping us with the distributed titles that we have in the record store. So like, we don't just obviously, as I mentioned, have Bridge 9 releases. We have all sorts of stuff, and from kind of more, mainstream like Ramones and Iggy Pop and like things that might be more of like kind of like higher level punk to the more kind of nitty gritty up and coming hardcore labels. And a lot of that stuff is coming from Death Wish. So for us to be able to say, hey, we need these records, and then just be able to walk one block over is pretty cool.
All right, man. Last question. What scene ethics do you hold on to this day?
I think the most important thing is to be honest with people and to nurture those relationships. I mean, I have people that I've worked with and known for going on 30 years now. And I think that that's one of the resources that a label brings, is the relationships that you have for decades. People that I worked with either in bands or from magazines or distributors, I'm still crossing paths with today. So I think it's important to, you don't burn those bridges, like you find common ground and you look to kind of push everyone's efforts forward, because you're going to run into them again.